The hum of the plane's engines drowned out most conversations, but Officer Richard Cole's gut told him something was wrong. He hadn't said a word yet, but his eyes kept drifting back to the black woman sitting calmly in first class, her fingers tapping on her phone. She didn't belong there, or so he thought, and soon he would act on a suspicion that would change both their lives forever. Before we get started, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more exciting content, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now let's dive in. The afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the airport as Senator Maya Thompson made her way through the terminal. Despite her casual attire, there was an air of quiet authority about her. She had grown accustomed to balancing between the public eye and her private life, but today she was focused on the political summit she would attend. It was a significant event, one where critical decisions about civil rights reform would be discussed, and her voice would be pivotal. The tension in her shoulders eased slightly as she boarded the plane. First class wasn't a luxury for her. It was simply a necessary part of traveling as a senator. Slipping into her seat, she exhaled, glad to have a moment of calm before the storm of meetings and debates. The plane filled up quickly, and Maya glanced around, noticing the variety of passengers around her. She was always people-watching, observing the silent interactions, the subtle judgments people made of each other. A few rows behind her, Officer Richard Cole boarded the same flight. Middle-aged, his face lined with years of stress and fatigue, he carried the weight of his job like an invisible burden. Richard was not a man given to reflection. Over 2 decades as a police officer had hardened him, making him more suspicious than understanding. He had seen things, he often told himself, things that had shaped the way he looked at the world. But beneath his tough exterior, there was a discomfort he wasn't ready to admit, even to himself. He scanned the cabin as he settled into his seat. When his eyes landed on Maya, sitting in first class, a flicker of unease passed through him. She was on her phone, casually texting or emailing, and something about her calmness bothered him. It wasn't just her casual demeanor. It was everything. The color of her skin, the confidence with which she held herself, it clashed with the assumptions he carried with him every day. Richard shifted in his seat, trying to ignore the discomfort gnawing at him. But he couldn't let go of the thought that something was off. As the flight attendants made their way down the aisle, offering pre-flight drinks, Richard's thoughts swirled with assumptions. In his mind, Maya's presence in first class didn't make sense. He knew nothing about her, but his mind had already made up a story. Maya, completely unaware of the growing scrutiny directed at her, focused on her upcoming speech. She had spent the last few months drafting legislation aimed at addressing racial profiling in law enforcement. The irony, of course, was that she was about to experience the very prejudice she fought against. For Maya, every step she took in her career felt like a battle, not only for herself but for the countless others who faced the same struggles daily. The weight of representation was always heavy on her shoulders, but she carried it with grace. The tension between the two strangers was invisible but palpable. Richard's glances grew more frequent, his unease turning into irritation. Why was she so comfortable? Why wasn't she on edge like other passengers he had seen before? His thoughts, fueled by years of prejudice and unchecked biases, spiraled further. As the plane taxied down the runway and lifted into the sky, the world below them seemed to disappear. But inside the cabin, the stage was set. A confrontation was brewing, one that neither Maya nor Richard could have predicted. For Maya, it was just another flight. For Richard, it was the beginning of something he would regret for the rest of his life. The flight attendants began their routine, the hum of the airplane blending with the soft chatter of passengers. Maya leaned back in her seat, letting the calm wash over her. But for Richard, the calm was suffocating. He couldn't stop thinking about Maya, who she was, why she was there, and why no one else seemed to notice what he saw. His thoughts raced, fueled by years of working in an environment where mistrust was the norm. He had seen too much, or so he thought. And now every person, every situation was a potential threat in his mind. Maya, with her calm, composed demeanor, had become the focus of his internal turmoil. In his mind, this was not about race, at least that's what he told himself. This was about gut instinct, something he had relied on for years. But as the flight continued, Richard's gut instinct was leading him down a dangerous path, a path paved with assumptions and biases that would soon collide with the reality of who Maya Thompson really was. The contrast between the two couldn't be more stark. Maya, on the brink of one of the most important political discussions of her career, was focused on the future. Richard, trapped by his own past and prejudices, was spiraling into a conflict of his own making. The tension simmered beneath the surface, ready to erupt in a way neither of them could foresee. As the plane soared through the clouds, the storm inside Richard Cole began to build. He had no idea that the woman he was fixating on was not only innocent, but also one of the most powerful voices for justice in the country. And soon, his actions would lead to a reckoning that neither of them could escape. The plane had reached cruising altitude, and the quiet hum of the engines filled the cabin. Passengers settled into their routines, some watching movies, others reading books, and a few catching up on sleep. For Maya, this was the perfect time to review her notes for the summit. She pulled out her tablet, scanning over the points she had meticulously prepared. This summit would be crucial in pushing forward the civil rights reforms she had worked on for years. The opportunity to address lawmakers and influential figures meant everything to her. However, a few rows behind her, Officer Richard Cole couldn't stop watching her every move. His discomfort had morphed into suspicion. A seed planted by years of entrenched bias, now growing into something more dangerous. Every glance Maya took at her phone, every tap on her tablet, seemed to confirm his fears. To Richard, she wasn't a senator working on critical legislation. She was a stranger, out of place in first class and acting suspiciously. His mind played tricks on him, convincing him that something was wrong, even though there was no evidence to support it. Richard leaned over, whispering to the flight attendant as she passed by. "Excuse me, ma'am, I'm not trying to cause a scene, but the woman up there, something about her just doesn't sit right with me. She's been on her phone a lot, and I've noticed her acting suspiciously. You might want to keep an eye on her." The flight attendant, used to odd passenger requests, smiled politely. "I'll make sure everything's fine, sir. Thank you for your concern." She moved on, not giving it much thought. But for Richard, her response wasn't enough. He sat back, staring at Maya, convinced that he needed to take matters into his own hands. Maya, oblivious to the scrutiny, continued working. Her mind was laser-focused on the summit. She knew what was at stake, not only for her career but for the communities she represented. As the only black woman in the Senate, her presence was a constant reminder that progress was being made, but the fight was far from over. Racial profiling, economic inequality, police reform. These were the issues that kept her awake at night. She had no idea that, in just a few minutes, she would find herself at the center of a real-world example of everything she was fighting against. Richard's suspicion reached a breaking point. He couldn't sit by any longer. Ignoring the fact that there was no logical reason to act, he stood up and walked toward Maya. The hum of the plane's engines seemed to fade as he approached her, his heart pounding in his chest. He told himself he was doing the right thing, that he had a duty to protect the passengers, to prevent something from happening before it was too late. Maya, engrossed in her work, didn't notice Richard until he was standing right beside her seat. When she looked up, she saw his face, a mix of authority and aggression, and was immediately confused. "Is there a problem?" she asked calmly, though she could feel a knot of anxiety forming in her stomach. She had faced this kind of confrontation before, but never in such an unexpected setting. Richard's voice was firm, though he tried to keep it low enough not to cause a scene. "I need to ask you a few questions. I've noticed you've been on your phone a lot, and your behavior has raised some concerns. What exactly are you doing?" Maya blinked, taken aback. "Excuse me?" Her voice remained composed, but she felt a surge of frustration. This wasn't the first time she had been singled out for no reason other than the color of her skin. She could sense where this was going. "I'm just doing my job," Richard continued, his posture rigid. "I've been watching you, and I need to make sure there's nothing going on here. You need to explain what you're up to." Maya's eyes narrowed slightly. "What I'm up to is preparing for a summit where I'll be speaking about, among other things, Racial profiling and law enforcement reform. Perhaps you're familiar with those topics? Her words hung in the air, sharp and pointed. She wasn't going to let herself be intimidated, especially not by someone who clearly had no idea who she was or what she stood for. Richard's jaw clenched. Her calm defiance only fueled his determination. Look, ma'am, I don't know what your story is, but I'm going to need to see some identification. You're acting suspicious, and I have a responsibility to ensure the safety of everyone on this plane. Maya felt the heat rise in her chest, but she remained poised. I'm not sure what you think I've done, but this is harassment. I'm sitting here minding my own business, and you're accusing me of… What exactly? Using my phone? The passengers around them began to stir, noticing the confrontation. Some exchanged worried glances, while others pulled out their phones to record the interaction. Maya could feel the eyes of everyone on her now, and the familiar weight of being under scrutiny returned. But she wasn't just another passenger. She was Maya Thompson, a senator, and she wasn't about to let this man strip her of her dignity. Captain Laura Johnson, alerted by the flight crew about the situation, stepped out of the cockpit. Her calm demeanor was a stark contrast to the growing tension in the cabin. She approached the scene with the measured steps of someone accustomed to diffusing difficult situations. Is there a problem here? Captain Johnson asked, her voice calm but authoritative. Richard turned to the captain, eager to explain. This woman's been acting suspiciously. I'm just trying to make sure everything is safe. The captain glanced at Maya, recognizing her immediately. But instead of revealing her identity right away, she addressed Richard. Sir, I understand your concern, but I don't believe there's any reason to be alarmed. Let's all take our seats and allow the flight to continue peacefully. Richard, however, wasn't ready to back down. You don't understand. I know something's off here. I've been a police officer for over 20 years. I know when someone's hiding something. The captain's eyes flickered with understanding. She knew this wasn't just about suspicion, it was about something deeper. Sir, please return to your seat. This situation is under control. Reluctantly, Richard stepped back, his frustration evident. He still didn't believe Maya's innocence, but he had no choice but to follow the captain's orders. As he walked back to his seat, the murmurs among the passengers grew louder. Maya, still seated, took a deep breath. She had been through worse, but it didn't make this moment any easier. The confrontation was far from over. Richard's determination had set in motion a series of events that would soon spiral beyond his control. And as Maya sat back, trying to regain her focus, she knew this was more than just a misunderstanding. It was a moment that would define everything that came next. The murmurs in the cabin spread like wildfire, and Maya could feel the weight of every pair of eyes on her. She took a deep breath, her hands gripping the armrests of her seat as she tried to calm the rising tide of frustration and exhaustion. This wasn't the first time she had faced something like this, but it never got easier. The public humiliation, the disbelief, and the judgment, it all came crashing down on her, wave after wave. Across the aisle, a man named John Taylor watched the scene unfold with growing concern. He was a lawyer by trade, and he had seen these types of confrontations before. Situations where a person's race was enough to incite suspicion, no matter their actions. He had been sitting quietly, trying to enjoy his flight, but now he felt compelled to intervene. John stood up and crossed the aisle, his expression calm but firm. "Excuse me," he said, directing his voice to Richard, who was still hovering near the aisle, his frustration evident in the way his arms crossed over his chest. "What exactly is going on here?" Richard turned to him, defensive, his voice gruff. "I'm just trying to keep everyone safe. This woman's been acting suspiciously, and I have a responsibility to investigate." John raised an eyebrow, glancing between Maya and Richard. "Suspiciously? She's sitting in her seat, working. You have no grounds for this, and frankly, it looks like you're profiling her." Richard's face hardened. "Look, I don't know what kind of lawyer tricks you're trying to pull here, but I've got over 20 years of experience in law enforcement. I know when something doesn't add up." 20 years of experience, John said, his voice even, "and you still can't tell the difference between a threat and a woman working on her tablet? What exactly do you think she's planning up here, in first class on a commercial flight?" Richard's mouth opened, but no words came out. He was used to getting compliance, to people backing down when he asserted himself, but this lawyer was challenging him in front of everyone. The tension hung thick in the air, and passengers around them shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Before Richard could respond, Captain Laura Johnson reappeared, her face set in a mask of professionalism. She had been following the conversation from the flight deck, and now it was clear that the situation required a firm hand. "Officer," the captain said, addressing Richard directly, "it's time for you to return to your seat." Richard's face flushed with indignation. "But—" "No," the captain interrupted, her voice as sharp as steel. "I've listened to your concerns, and I've assessed the situation. There is no threat here. You are creating a disruption, and I will not allow this flight to be compromised any further. If you cannot comply, we will be forced to take further action." Her words hit Richard like a punch to the gut. He had always been the one giving orders, the one in control. Now, standing in the aisle of this plane, surrounded by passengers who were beginning to turn against him, he felt something unfamiliar: vulnerability. But instead of backing down gracefully, his instinct was to double down, to defend his actions. "She's lying," Richard said, his voice low but filled with tension. "I know she's not who she says she is." The captain's eyes narrowed. "You don't know who she is, officer, but I do." She turned to Maya, her expression softening with recognition. "Senator Thompson, I'm sorry for this inconvenience. I'll ensure that this is handled appropriately." The shift in the cabin was immediate. The murmurs grew louder as passengers processed what had just been said. Senator Thompson. Maya's title hung in the air like a revelation, changing the entire dynamic of the situation. Richard's eyes widened in disbelief, his face turning a deep shade of red. Maya met the captain's eyes, her expression one of quiet gratitude. She had remained silent throughout the confrontation, knowing that engaging too soon would only escalate things. But now, with the truth out in the open, she felt a mixture of relief and bitterness. She shouldn't have had to endure this, not as a senator, not as a human being. Richard was stunned, his mind racing to catch up with what had just been revealed. Senator? How could that be? How could this woman he had just accused of being suspicious, be a senator? He had convinced himself so thoroughly that she was dangerous. And now the truth hit him with the force of a freight train. "She's a senator?" Richard muttered, more to himself than anyone else. His defenses crumbled as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. "Yes," the captain said, her tone cool and unwavering. "Senator Maya Thompson, and you've caused her and everyone else on this flight undue stress." Richard took a step back, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. He had profiled her. He had made assumptions based on her appearance, her skin color, and nothing else. And now, standing in the spotlight of his own ignorance, he didn't know how to reconcile what he had done. John, still standing nearby, shook his head slowly. This is exactly what people like Senator Thompson are fighting against. Racial profiling, discrimination. It's not just about the law. It's about people like you assuming the worst because of the way someone looks. Richard's mouth was dry, his throat tight. He wanted to defend himself, to explain that he wasn't a bad person, that he wasn't racist. But the words wouldn't come. He had no defense for what he had done. In his heart, he knew the truth. He had acted out of prejudice. The passengers were watching now, their judgment clear. Some murmured in agreement with John, others shook their heads at Richard. The tide had turned, and Richard felt like he was drowning in the weight of his own actions. Maya stood up slowly, her movements graceful and composed, despite the turmoil of emotions swirling inside her. She turned to Richard, her eyes locking with his. "Do you see me now?" she asked, her voice calm but filled with emotion. "Do you see me for who I am, or am I still just a threat to you?" Her words pierced through him like a knife. For the first time in his life, Richard couldn't hide behind his badge, his authority, or his experience. He was laid bare, exposed for what he had done. He had misjudged her, not because of anything she had done, but because of who she was. And now, he was forced to confront that ugly truth. I'm sorry," Richard stammered, though the words felt hollow even as he said them. He knew an apology wouldn't be enough. It couldn't undo what had just happened, the damage he had caused, the humiliation he had inflicted. Maya didn't respond immediately. She simply looked at him, her gaze piercing through the layers of guilt and shame that now consumed him. Finally, she turned away, addressing the captain. "Thank you for your assistance, Captain. I would like to sit down now, if that's all right." "Of course, Senator," the captain replied, nodding. "We'll take care of everything." Maya sat back in her seat, her hands trembling slightly as she placed them in her lap. She had been through worse, but this felt different. It wasn't just the confrontation. It was the reminder of how far society still had to go, how deeply ingrained prejudice remained, even in the most everyday situations. As Richard slumped back to his seat, the full weight of his actions settled over him like a suffocating blanket. The reality of what he had done, the harm he had caused, pressed down on him until he could barely breathe. He had always thought of himself as a good man, a fair man. But now, for the first time, he was forced to see himself through someone else's eyes. And he didn't like what he saw. The plane descended slowly toward the nearest airport for an unscheduled landing. A silence, heavy and uncomfortable, had settled over the cabin, broken only by the faint hum of the engines and occasional murmurs from the passengers. Richard Cole sat stiffly in his seat, the enormity of his actions sinking in with every passing second. He avoided eye contact with anyone, especially Maya. The man who had once been so certain, so convinced of his instincts, now felt a deep, unfamiliar shame. His mind swirled with questions he couldn't answer. How had he been so wrong? Why had he reacted the way he did? But beneath those questions, another feeling gnawed at him. A bitter recognition that perhaps this wasn't the first time he had misjudged someone. For years, Richard had prided himself on his instincts, his ability to read people. But now those instincts had betrayed him, exposing something he had long denied to himself: his prejudices. The plane landed without incident, and as it taxied to a stop, airport security and airline representatives gathered outside the gate prepared to meet the passengers and address the situation. Richard's heart raced, knowing what was coming. His authority, his badge, none of it could protect him now. He had crossed a line, and there would be no simple way back. The captain made an announcement over the intercom, her voice calm but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've made an unscheduled landing due to an incident on board. We ask that everyone remain in their seats as airport officials board the plane. Thank you for your cooperation." Richard closed his eyes briefly, trying to steady his breathing. He had spent years handling tense situations, but now the tension was his own doing, and he felt utterly powerless. Maya sat a few rows ahead, her face composed, but her mind racing. She had handled herself with grace during the confrontation, but now, in the quiet aftermath, the emotional toll began to weigh on her. She had fought her whole life for equality, for justice, for an end to the very kind of treatment she had just endured. Yet here she was, a senator, still being profiled, still being humiliated. No amount of success or power had shielded her from the reality of prejudice. She glanced out the window, her reflection staring back at her, and for a moment, she allowed herself to feel the anger and sadness that she had pushed down during the confrontation. But even in her anger, there was resolve. This incident, painful as it was, only reaffirmed the importance of her work. She would not be silenced, and she would not let this moment define her. She had fought too hard to let it break her spirit. The doors of the plane opened, and uniformed officers stepped inside. They moved quickly but professionally, heading directly toward Richard. As they approached, he felt a chill run down his spine. He was on the other side now, the one being questioned, the one being judged. His hands trembled slightly as he stood, his mind racing with everything he wished he could say to justify his actions, to explain himself. But he knew that nothing he said would change what he had done. The officers escorted him off the plane without fanfare, but the passengers' eyes followed him, judgment in every gaze. Some whispered to each other, shaking their heads. Others recorded on their phones, capturing the final moments of the man who had so confidently assumed control, now being led away in disgrace. The world had shifted for Richard, and the consequences were only just beginning. Back inside the terminal, after what felt like hours of processing, Richard found himself sitting in a small room with his wife Anna. She had arrived at the airport as soon as she heard about the incident, her face pale and her expression a mix of shock and concern. Anna had always known Richard was tough. His job had demanded it, but she had never seen him like this, vulnerable, ashamed, and uncertain. For a long time, they sat in silence. Richard stared at the floor, the weight of everything pressing down on him. Anna shifted in her seat, trying to make sense of what had happened. She had heard bits and pieces of the story, enough to understand that Richard had profiled a black woman on the plane, not knowing she was a senator. But the details didn't matter as much as the truth beneath it all. Her husband, the man she had known and loved for years, had allowed his biases to take control. Finally Anna spoke, her voice soft but steady. "Richard, what happened up there?" Richard didn't look at her. "I thought I was doing the right thing," he muttered, his voice thick with regret. "I thought I was protecting everyone." Anna let out a slow breath. Protecting them from what? A woman sitting in first class? "It wasn't like that," he began, but Anna cut him off, her tone sharper now. "Wasn't it? You looked at her and saw a threat. Why? Because of her skin color? Because she didn't fit the image in your head of who belongs in first class?" Richard finally looked up, meeting his wife's eyes. In that moment, he saw the disappointment there, and it broke something inside him. "I don't know," he whispered. "I don't know why I did it." Anna's face softened, but there was still a distance between them. A gap that Richard wasn't sure how to bridge. "You've always been so sure of yourself," she said quietly. "But this was wrong, Richard. You know it was wrong." He nodded, the shame tightening around his chest like a vice. "I know," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I don't know how to fix this." Anna reached out, placing her hand on his. "Maybe you can't fix it, but you can start by admitting you were wrong. By listening. This is bigger than just you, Richard. It's about how we see people, how we judge them, and if you can't see that, I don't know what comes next for us." Her words cut deep, but Richard knew she was right. This wasn't just about the incident on the plane. It was about something much deeper, something he had ignored for too long. The biases that had shaped his thinking, the assumptions he had made about people based on nothing more than appearances. Those things had led him here, to this moment. And now he had to face the consequences. Meanwhile, in a hotel room not far from the airport, Maya sat quietly with her phone in hand, scrolling through the messages of support that had flooded in since the story had broken. News outlets were already covering the incident, headlines blaring across social media. Senator Maya Thompson racially profiled on flight by off-duty officer. She had expected this kind of attention. In fact, she knew it would happen the moment she revealed her identity on the plane. But that didn't make it any easier. The media frenzy, the public outrage, it was all part of the cycle. And while Maya appreciated the support, it didn't erase the emotional toll the event had taken on her. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was her assistant, bringing a cup of tea and a moment of quiet comfort. Maya took the cup gratefully, sipping it as she stared out the window at the city lights. She had a press conference to prepare for, an opportunity to speak about the incident, to address the broader issue of racial profiling, and to push for the reforms she had dedicated her life to. But even as she thought about what she would say, Maya couldn't shake the feeling of exhaustion. How many more times would she have to fight this battle? How many more incidents like this would it take for real change to happen? The questions weighed on her, but she knew she couldn't stop. Too much was at stake, not just for her, but for everyone who had experienced what she had. Maya closed her eyes for a moment, letting the calm wash over her. She had been profiled, humiliated, and judged, but she had also been heard, supported, and believed. And in that, there was power. Several weeks had passed since the incident on the plane, but the ripples it caused had not yet subsided. The story had spread far beyond the initial headlines, prompting discussions on news outlets, social media, and even in political circles. Racial profiling once again was in the spotlight, and the uncomfortable truth about its pervasiveness was impossible to ignore. Maya Thompson had continued to push forward with her work, but the weight of the experience still lingered. The press conference she held shortly after the incident had been powerful. Her words were direct, her message clear. "This isn't just about me," she had said. This is about a system that allows assumptions to be made based on the color of one's skin, and how those assumptions can lead to harmful, even dangerous consequences. Her speech had resonated with millions, sparking conversations about systemic racism and police reform across the country. But for Maya, this wasn't just a political issue. It was personal. The confrontation on that plane had brought back memories of her early days in politics, when she had been underestimated, overlooked, and judged because of her race. And while she had risen above those challenges, this experience had reminded her that the fight was far from over. Still, Maya found strength in the work. She had been instrumental in drafting new legislation aimed at addressing racial profiling in law enforcement, and the incident had given her an even greater platform to push for change. Her office was flooded with letters of support, and her allies in the Senate were working with her to ensure the bill would gain momentum. But as much as Maya's public life was focused on the future, her personal life had been deeply affected by what happened. She had never allowed herself to become bitter, but there was a quiet sadness in her now, a recognition that no matter how far she had come, the shadow of prejudice still loomed over her. There were moments when she questioned whether the world would ever truly change. Would there always be people like Richard Cole, who saw her skin color before they saw her humanity? Meanwhile, Richard Cole was grappling with his own reckoning. In the aftermath of the incident, he had been suspended from his job, pending an investigation. His department had distanced itself from him, and his reputation within the community had taken a significant hit. For a man who had spent his life in law enforcement, it was a devastating blow. But what hurt the most wasn't the suspension or the public backlash. It was the realization that he had been wrong. Deeply, unequivocally wrong. Richard had spent years building his identity around being a protector, someone who upheld the law and kept people safe. He had convinced himself that his instincts were infallible, that his experience gave him a unique ability to read situations and people. But on that plane, his instincts had led him astray. He had looked at Maya Thompson and seen a threat, not because of anything she had done, but because of the assumptions he had carried with him for so long. His conversations with Anna in the days following the incident had been some of the most difficult of his life. She had been patient but firm, forcing him to confront the prejudices he had long denied. It wasn't easy for Richard to admit that his view of the world had been shaped by biases he didn't even realize he held. But as the days turned into weeks, he began to see it more clearly. Anna had suggested that he attend a racial sensitivity workshop, a program designed to help law enforcement officers and other professionals confront their own biases and learn how to engage more thoughtfully with communities of color. At first, Richard had resisted. He didn't think a workshop would change anything, and he wasn't sure he was ready to face the uncomfortable truths it would bring to light. But as the days wore on, and the weight of his actions pressed down on him, Richard realized that he had to do something. He couldn't just sit at home, wallowing in regret. He needed to take action, not just to salvage his career, but to become a better person, someone who could look at himself in the mirror without feeling ashamed. And so, reluctantly at first, Richard signed up for the workshop. The workshop was nothing like Richard had expected. It wasn't just about sitting in a room and listening to lectures about racism and prejudice. It was about listening to people, real people, who had experienced the kind of discrimination Richard had perpetuated. The stories he heard were raw, emotional, and deeply personal. Each one peeled back another layer of denial, forcing Richard to see the world through the eyes of those he had misjudged for so long. One story in particular stayed with him. A young man, not much older than Richard's own son, stood before the group and shared his experience of being stopped by the police nearly every month as he walked home from work. He wasn't doing anything wrong, just walking in his own neighborhood, but because of his skin color, he was constantly viewed as a suspect. The fear in his voice, the exhaustion in his eyes, struck Richard deeply. It was the same fear he had seen in Maya's eyes on the plane, though she had masked it with composure and dignity. The young man's story broke something open in Richard, and for the first time, he truly understood the harm he had caused. It wasn't just about that one incident on the plane. It was about the cumulative effect of years of assumptions and biases, not just from him, but from people like him. People who thought they were doing the right thing, but were actually perpetuating a cycle of fear and mistrust. As the workshop continued, Richard found himself participating more, asking questions, and engaging in difficult conversations. He realized that change wasn't something that happened overnight. It was a process, one that required humility, self-reflection, and a willingness to listen. And for the first time in his life, Richard was ready to do all of those things. Several months after the workshop, Richard reached out to Maya Thompson through her office. It wasn't easy for him to make that decision, but he knew he had to. He had spent too long avoiding the confrontation he most feared, the one where he would have to face the person he had wronged and admit his failure. Maya's assistant had been hesitant at first, unsure if she should even pass the message along. But when Maya heard that Richard wanted to meet with her, she was surprised. She had assumed she would never see him again, that their paths had crossed for that brief, unfortunate moment, and that would be the end of it. But something in his request intrigued her, and after some deliberation, she agreed to meet him. The meeting took place in a quiet conference room, far from the media spotlight. Richard arrived early, his palms sweaty, his heart racing. He had practiced what he wanted to say over and over in his head, but now that the moment was here, he wasn't sure how to begin. When Maya entered the room, she was as poised and dignified as he remembered. She sat across from him, her eyes calm but curious. There was no anger in her gaze, but there was no forgiveness either, at least not yet. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. Richard's throat felt dry, and the words he had practiced seemed to vanish from his mind. But then, taking a deep breath, he began. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said, his voice low but steady. "But I wanted to apologize. I was wrong. Everything I did on that plane, the way I treated you, it was wrong. And I'm sorry." Maya listened, her expression unreadable. She had heard many apologies in her life, but this one felt different. There was something genuine in Richard's tone, something raw and unguarded. "I've spent the last few months trying to understand why I did what I did," Richard continued. "And I know now that it wasn't about you. It was about me. My own biases, my own prejudices. I've been doing a lot of reflecting, and I've learned a lot. But I know that doesn't erase what happened." Maya nodded slightly, allowing him to speak. When he finished, there was a long pause. "Do you really understand?" Maya asked quietly, her voice steady, but with a hint of challenge. "Do you understand that what happened on that plane wasn't just about one incident? It's about a lifetime of assumptions, a lifetime of being seen as less, simply because of the color of my skin. Do you understand the weight of that?" Richard swallowed hard. "I'm beginning to," he said, his voice almost a whisper, "and I'm sorry it took me so long to see it." For a moment Maya simply looked at him, her eyes searching his face for something, authenticity perhaps, or the depth of his remorse. Finally she spoke. "Apology accepted," she said, her tone measured. "But this isn't about forgiveness, it's about change. What are you going to do to make sure this doesn't happen again? Not just to me, but to anyone?" Richard nodded, his voice firmer now. "I've already started. I'm committed to continuing the work. I know it's not going to be easy, but I'm not going to stop." Maya stood, signaling that the meeting was over. "That's all anyone can ask," she said, offering a small, respectful nod. "Thank you for your apology, Richard, and good luck." As Richard watched her leave the room, he felt a mixture of relief and determination. He knew the road ahead would be long and difficult. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was on the right path. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.